From the research bench to the patient's bedside, this is Bench to Bedside with your host, Vice Chancellor and Director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center, Dr. Roy Jensen.
Only 1 in 30 people with cancer enroll in a clinical trial. Even more concerning, participation rates among some minorities are particularly low, despite higher rates of certain cancers and overall poorer outcomes. Through clinical trials, doctors find new ways to treat, diagnose, manage symptoms, and prevent cancer. That means that some groups of people are missing out on the chance to potentially benefit from leading-edge therapies and techniques. When we lack diversity in clinical research, we miss out on valuable information that tells us whether the results of the study can be generalized to the broader public. Age, gender, ethnic origin, all of these factors and more may play a role in the effectiveness of a cancer therapy. Good morning. I'm Dr. Roy Jensen, Vice Chancellor and Director of the University of Kansas Cancer Center. And here to talk with us about how a lack of diversity in research impedes progress against cancer and what we can do about it is Dr. Tara Lynn, hematologist and medical oncologist and medical director of the Cancer Center's Clinical Trials Office. And joining us virtually is Cici Rojas, cancer survivor and a leader in Kansas City's Latinx community.
Active civic leader Cici Rojas owns a production company with her husband, Oscar. They travel all over the country, handling big sports clients. They're always on the go.
I think I was doing what a lot of women do. I was burning the candle literally at both ends. So I was, working really hard.
But when her energy levels dropped significantly, she knew something was up.
I felt a lump in my abdomen. And at that point, I knew that it was probably something very serious.
She called her doctor, and after a battery of tests, her fears were confirmed.
When you hear those 3 words, you have cancer, it's like, it's like a fist that grabs your heart.
After 6 rounds of chemo, her cancer appeared to be gone. But just a few months later, it was back.
I'll never forget it. I found a lump in my neck on the plane. By the time I landed, I felt another soft spot on my scalp.
But the news wasn't all bad. Her doctors at the University of Kansas Cancer Center told her that she qualified for a clinical trial and underwent what's called CAR-T therapy.
After 30 days, I was cancer-free. It's a tough 30 days.
Cici says it's important to take your own health into your hands, ask questions, find out if you qualify for any groundbreaking trials.
It was a dark, long tunnel, but we were able to see the light right at the end.
You want to surround yourself with positive things in your life and spend time with things that bring you joy.
Dr. Lynn, tell us, what is a clinical trial and how do clinical trials work?
First, I want to say thank you both for joining us today to have this important conversation. When we think about clinical trials, a clinical trial is really the way that we test new ideas with the goal of improving treatments and outcomes for our cancer patients. We know that advances in cancer prevention, diagnosis, and treatment come through rigorous clinical trials. A trial can be a study of a new medicine in combination with older medicines, or test a combination of already approved medicines that we're trying to use in a new way. Clinical trials not only test medication, but they study surgical techniques and radiation therapy as well.
So could you tell us a little bit about the so-called phases of clinical trials? How are these phases different from one another?
Sure. So there are a lot of different types of clinical trials, trials that span the whole spectrum of cancer therapy. So trials to look at how we screen for cancer, prevent cancer, diagnose cancer, treat cancer, and improve outcomes for patients. When we talk about the phases of clinical research, this gives us a sense of how far in, say, drug development a new medication is in becoming available for patients. So an early phase clinical trial would be something that's in, say, phase 1 or phase 2. And this is really the first time we're testing this medication in people. There are different levels within phase 1, trials and drugs that are a little bit further along. But we're really trying to understand the safety of those medicines as well as their potential benefit for patients. drugs that have a proven safety record and have a good signal in terms of being beneficial for patients will then enter later phase trials, such as a phase 3 trial, where we're really comparing the current standard of treatment versus a regimen that might have this newer drug in it to really try to leap over the hurdle and really develop what we would call a new standard of care. Most drugs that are developed are going to require later phase 3 data in order to be approved by the FDA. We are very lucky here at the University of Kansas that we have a very strong phase 1 program, as well as a very strong program in later phase trials, so that we can get our patients earlier access to these new and innovative treatments.
So, Dr. Lynn, looking from a patient's perspective, what are the benefits of participating in a clinical trial?
Whenever we talk to someone about participating in a clinical trial, it's important that they understand, the risks and the benefits of participation. Certainly for an individual, there's a potential benefit in that they may receive a newer treatment or a different treatment that's better than what we would do otherwise, which could improve their response rates and hopefully ultimately improve their survival. We know that there are also benefits to people who participate in clinical trials. Overall, the rates of survival are higher in patients who participate in clinical trials versus those who get standard of care. And we also know that patients who are treated at an NCI-designated cancer center have improved outcomes, again, in large part because of the access to clinical trials that you have in an NCI-designated center such as ours. Besides the potential to the individual patient, we also learn a lot from everyone who participates on a clinical trial. Clinical trial participants help cancer researchers understand more about cancer biology, why certain treatments work or don't work in different cancer subtypes or in different patient subtypes. And then we also can understand how drugs are processed and metabolized by the body. Because the benefits of clinical trial participation aren't just limited to the individual, but because they really inform the way that we treat that cancer in the bigger picture, it's really critical that we have patients of diverse genders, diverse ethnicities and races, as well as across the lifespan, including patients of all ages, as we test these therapies because of the implications for cancer treatment as a whole.
Well, Cici, thank you so much for joining us today. And maybe to start off with, could you give us a bit of a background on your own personal cancer journey?
I went through what was pretty much the standard of care to treat my cancer early on, which was chemotherapy. And after I went through that process, I found myself in remission for 7 months, which was great. And then after that, I relapsed. And so the team there recommended a trial, a CAR-T, which was pretty new at the time. I think I was patient 5 or 6. And I really didn't know much about cancer trials, but I did do some research, and I felt like that was a good option for me. And it made it less scary, the more homework I did around it and talking to other folks about trials. And I went through the CAR-T trial successfully, and I was in remission for about 8 to 9 months. And then unfortunately I relapsed again. But my care team felt it was best for me to go through one more round of CAR-T so that it would be a bridge to a full-blown bone marrow transplant, which I ended up having to undergo. And they made it early as an option for me to get to where I needed to go for the bone marrow transplant. And I'm about 1.5 years out of that now. So, feel really good.
Wow. So you said that, prior to participating in the CAR-T trial, you had not really heard too much about clinical trials. Could you tell us a little bit about kind of the process that you went through to come to the decision to participate in the clinical trial?
Your team, Dr. McGurk, approached me really, very early on, as soon as I relapsed, because I had, obviously there's certain markers and there's certain criteria that I met to make myself a good match for CAR T, and they were, very very thorough. The folks that everybody I talked to on the care team about, what I could expect. They really gave me a lot of information. And so, for me, it felt like the best option, at least to try it and to see, what the outcome could be. And I was pretty excited about having another option, and to see and to explore. At that point, you really have nothing to lose, but you have everything to gain.
Yeah.
And so it was a pretty seamless process. Well, that part was seamless. What followed wasn't necessarily seamless, but yes.
Yeah. So if you're just joining us, we're here with Dr. Tara Lynn and Cici Rojas discussing the vital importance of diversity in clinical research. Remember to share this link with people you think might benefit from our discussion. Use the hashtag BenchToBedside. Dr. Lynn, what are the misconceptions that you hear about clinical trials?
It is surprising that only 1 in 30 cancer patients participates in a clinical trial, but we have to remember that a cancer diagnosis is overwhelming for everyone, regardless of how much experience they've had in the medical system. And many patients and families have never even heard the term clinical trial or have a real idea about what it means to participate in research. I will hear some patients say that they don't want to be a guinea pig. They don't want to be experimented on without potential for benefit. And this, to me, says, that patients are worried that they're not going to get the basic standard of care, that they might get something experimental that would be less than what they would get if they weren't participating in the trial. I can absolutely guarantee that all cancer clinical trials are carefully written and considered. They are reviewed by the FDA, and every hospital has its own, what we call the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, which is made up of scientists and community members to really ensure that all patients on a trial are treated safely and are treated appropriately and don't have a compromise in their care because they're participating in a trial. Many trials will add a new medicine for all the patients getting the treatment. In other cases, some studies will give, say, half the patients a standard treatment plus a new medicine, and then half of the patients would get a standard medicine without the new medicine, so that we can really do the rigorous testing needed to show that the new medicine is better, and make sure that it doesn't add too many side effects. Another comment that I hear from patients is that clinical trials are only really an option as a last-ditch effort when there's nothing else that we can try for their cancer. And this maybe was the case a long time ago, but it's certainly not the case now. We have made such advances in cancer treatment, but we still have a very long way to go. And so a lot of the trials that we're seeing is actually taking what would be the standard treatment, even for a newly diagnosed person, and adding the option of something new. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that clinical research isn't just for people who've seen all of the standard treatment, that it can really be important even at the time of first diagnosis, or as Cici had her clinical trial experience when a cancer has come back. I also hear people worry that joining a clinical trial will have a financial impact or increase their costs. It's important to note that all study-related procedures and medicines are covered by the clinical trial. We have a team of financial counselors here at KU in the Cancer Center that will submit clinical trial information to a patient's insurance company to make sure that routine care is covered. So for example, when I have a patient on a leukemia clinical trial, the trial pays for the new medicine, for any extra lab tests that are needed, but we make sure that the insurance company is going to continue to pay for the routine blood work and other tests that the patient would need just as part of their standard care. We also sometimes see that patients are hesitant to join a clinical trial because it's just so much new information coming at once. They're just getting a new diagnosis of cancer. They're having to process and think about what regular treatments look like. And sometimes having information about the option for a clinical trial can be very overwhelming. And so that's why it's so important that communication is so important in this process. A good line of communication from the patient and their family, asking the physician and care team questions, and the physician and care team meeting that patient where they are in order to provide information so that the right decision, the best decision can be made for the patient at that time.
Mm-hmm. So, of course, one of the things which COVID has taught us over the last few months is the level of really striking health disparities across different demographic groups in the United States and elsewhere. And one data point which I think helps to back that up is if you look at African American and Hispanic enrollment in cancer clinical trials over the last 2 decades, it's actually declined. And one of the things that we hope to do today is to talk about what are some of those barriers that different groups feel to enrolling on clinical trials. And Cici, maybe you could kind of kick off the discussion of things that you see that are particular issues around getting folks enrolled on clinical trials.
I think first and foremost, there's still a big lack of awareness about trials, not just for the patient, but for their family, the people that they surround themselves with. It's very daunting, and I think that the simpler we can make it for this community, and it's not just how we message, and to break it down into the headlines, for example, that it is an option. And it's not something that you would do, and the fact that there are better outcomes for people that do participate in clinical trials. So, I think that there's some headlines and messaging that could be simplified when we're communicating with this community, with the target markets. And, and obviously in language, in culture is very important. Things translate differently in Spanish than they would, in any language, really. So, you really have to be authentic in how you message and what you message. And it's also equally important to think about the messengers, that are trusted in the community, that would be able to, you walk into these communities and immediately have credibility. And so I think that those are some things that would be very helpful. And the other thing I'll note is, the Latino community and even the African American community, they're very multi-generational in a household. So you can have, it's not unusual for 4 or 5 people to come or want to come to an appointment, first, when they're starting their treatment. And I think that that's something that should be embraced, because then you've got 4 or 5 messengers, as opposed to one. You've got 3 or 4 people out, that have knowledge and can go out and further tell the story about the options of clinical trials. And it's not scary. It's not this big unknown. It's a viable option, and you have better chances of long-term survivorship.
So those are some great suggestions. Is there anything specifically that you think the University of Kansas Cancer Center can do to involve more people of color in clinical research efforts?
I mean, obviously identifying people early on, and much like myself, I started getting the information back from your team there. I mean, they were great about follow-up. I mean, they made sure that I had information. They made sure that my family member. I think it really needs to start at the onset, that communication, the communication about the options of clinical trials. And I think I think the messaging could even begin with your partners, your external partners in the FQHCs and places like that, where, this is it's probably going to be their first point of entry, a pathway into the healthcare system. And I think that those messages need to be communicated far, way beyond someone is even in the process of getting a diagnosis. I mean, it needs to start there.
So, participation in clinical trials is really part of the answer there. What what else do you think we can do to encourage broader participation in research in general among communities such as the Hispanic community?
I really believe you would. The fact about the Latino community is it's the youngest demographic in terms of, you look at all the demographics, and our median age is I don't know, a good 5 years beyond less than other demographic groups. So the key is hitting our young up and coming Latinos, and so targeting those young group, the young friends groups, and any kind of activity that they would be drawn to. We do a lot of multicultural marketing in our business, and would you have to show up in non-traditional spaces and start the messaging there, because that's where you're going to find the trusted spaces. And so I believe the key is, hitting it at a young age. And because it's multicultural, multi-generational households, a young person, is going to come, and quite candidly, in many cases, be bringing information and education opportunities to the rest of the household. So it's not unusual, even for small businesses, to have teenagers communicating with vendors, because maybe there's their parents and maybe the grandparents are they're Spanish dominant. So I mean, there's a couple different strategies, I think, to get it, to start laying the groundwork early on with a community, and those are just a couple things off the top of my head.
Cici was an influencer across this city long before I think we started even using that term. And if someone is tuning in today to hear her story, and they have recently been diagnosed with cancer, how would someone in that situation become involved in a clinical trial, Dr. Lynn? Who would you suggest they get in contact or touch base with?
So it's so important when patients are facing a new diagnosis of cancer or at a treatment decision point to think about whether or not a clinical trial makes sense. And so, obviously we can have our patients ask their physicians about whether a clinical trial is right for you. But it's also important for the physician to be considering each patient that they're seeing to think about whether or not a clinical trial is right for that patient with where they are in their cancer journey. There are many tools online, such as clinicaltrials.gov, the KU Cancer website, kucc.org/trials, and the KUCC Clinical Trial Finder app, which you can get on the Apple Store or on Android, where you can search by cancer type and see what trials we have available. And then there's also information about how to directly connect to our team. Having these resources available is really important, but like Cici said, it's really awareness. If people don't know that trials are even an option and don't know to ask these questions, then we've really not done our jobs as physicians and as the Cancer Center to really spread the word. And so programs like this, working with our leaders in the community through the Cancer Center Community Advisory Board, really to get the word out that clinical trials are an important option, is really one of the best first steps.
Well, we're nearing the end of today's episode, and I'd like to hear from each of you. What is your advice for someone who is considering a clinical trial and may be scared or hesitant about that choice?
First and foremost, I think you'd want to ask, maybe a couple of people that might have gone through a clinical trial or even has your same diagnosis, to understand, what, how they're feeling and how they're approaching, their care plan. I would do some research. It's very easy to find, as you noted. There's many resources and out there for them. And, I think it's really important, too, that they go to trusted sites, trusted resources, because, there's a lot of misinformation out there on, anywhere you'd look. So I think that, I would, that would be my advice. I would be, it'd be absolutely, you need to consider it. It is an option. And you want to have as many options as you can when you start, and you have a diagnosis like this. And it's one more weapon for you to, to have in your arsenal, because, and the more information you have, the more options you have, the better outcomes you're going to have.
And Dr. Lynn?
Everything that Cici said is absolutely correct. And I think communication is really the critical piece of this for a patient or an individual to really feel like they can ask as many questions as they need to, so that they have an understanding of how trials work, how it may be of benefit to them as an individual. The trusted websites, the National Cancer Institute website, all of these pieces are important. There's also the option to get a second opinion. And so it may be worth talking to another oncologist to review the information, see if those treatment recommendations line up. And here at KU, we offer telehealth appointments that can be done just to review information when someone's at a treatment decision point. I think, right, the take-home message from all of this is really that clinical trials are an option. They're a great option for many people. And the key is really to have the information that you need in order to make the best choice for your personal treatment plans.
Well, that's it for today, and I want to thank both of you so much for joining the program, in particular, Cici. Your sharing your story is such a critical thing for people to hear in this community, and we so appreciate your willingness to be on. To learn more about clinical trials, visit kucancercenter.org/clinical trials. Join us next week at 10 a.m. for Bench to Bedside. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our Bench to Bedside podcast, now everywhere podcasts are available.